heartening to see old students, current students, colleagues, kind of all the above. I note in particular a couple people here. There's Nick, and I saw Alex somewhere. Where's Alex? Oh, yeah, who were in a PhD seminar that I taught in the spring of 2016 that they were both in which they saw sort of the kind of penultimate version of the manuscript and kind of spent a week completely tearing it apart and was enormously helpful, and I think shows kind of just, hopefully they got a lot out of it, I know I got a lot out of it, and shows kind of, you know, what Georgetown can be and how great it can be for both faculty and hopefully for students as well. I'm really, thank you all for coming. So I want to talk about this book that's just out with Cornell, and there were two options. There was to have the bookstore come here with actual copies to sell it full freight to you, or Cornell has kindly given me, since it's outrageously priced to begin with, has kindly given me a flyer that has a discount code on it, and so I opted for door number 2, and so there are flyers in the back there that you can get a discount if you're so inclined, and I'm always happy to sign copies if anybody does get a copy of it. And so this has been a book that's been in the works for a while, and that I've been thinking about the issues in it for a while. And Tom mentioned that I did study with John Mearsheimer, and I think it's fair to say that John won't agree with many of the conclusions in this book or many of the arguments in this book, and that's okay. And in fact, some of what Mearsheimer wrote in 2001 in Tragedy, Great Power, Politics is a bit of a launching point for this book. Those of you who remember Tragedy, Great Power, Politics and the argument that he makes in that book, he says in the conclusion that he expects that the United States will pursue a much more competitive strategy towards China. Right? He expects that great powers seek to maximize their relative power, and in the context of a rising China, that ought to mean that the United States would be fearful of a rising China and pursue strategies that sought to constrain that rise and inhibit that rise in a variety of ways. And I thought at the time when I read that, I thought there was something problematic about that argument. And what I thought was problematic about that argument, and which kind of in many ways launched the argument that I'm going to present today, what I thought was problematic about it was a certain assumption about the nature of American time horizons and the time horizons of American leaders thinking about that relationship, namely the idea that American leaders would be willing to forego present opportunities to benefit from cooperation for fear of a long-term threat from China, right? That everyone at the time realized China wasn't, if it ever did kind of reach the full potential of its rise, that wasn't going to occur 30, 40 years from when he was writing, and if that's the case, can we really expect American leaders to sacrifice potential economic benefits, other benefits from cooperation in the short term for fear of that long-term threat? And that got me thinking about the argument that I want to make today, which is about time horizons and how leaders respond to rising great powers. So just to kind of put this in a little bit of context, this is Deng Xiaoping's famous policy: observe things coolly, manage things calmly, hold one's ground, hide our capacities and bide our time, get some things done. Deng said this just about at the end of the Cold War in reference to how China should approach its own rise. And one of the things that I want to argue today is that, in fact, it behooves rising great powers to be patient in the way that Deng was suggesting. And that Deng's sort of observation here about sort of biding China's time was something that would in fact benefit China because it would lead to more cooperation between China and other countries, including the United States. On the other hand, our old friend Machiavelli, this is a long quote, but I think it's worth thinking about, said, quote, "The Romans did just what every wise ruler ought to do. You have to keep an eye not only on present troubles, but on those of the future, and make every effort to avoid them." That is how it goes in affairs of state. When you recognize evils in advance as they take shape, you quickly cure them. But when you have not seen them, and so let them grow till anyone can recognize them, there is no longer a remedy. Right? So Machiavelli there basically saying you ought to address these potential long-term threats out there. You ought to address them sooner rather than later, right? Because at some point they're going to grow so powerful that there's nothing left that you can do about them. All right, so this is the puzzle that motivates the book in many ways. In a variety of different ways, I would argue that the U.S. has in fact aided and abetted the rise of China over the last few decades, right? Whether it be through economic cooperation, diplomatic cooperation, even some forms of military cooperation. Yet, history suggests that relations between rising and declining great powers rarely end well, right? We know this historically, that there's often conflict between such powers. So the question is, why would the United States pursue such policies toward a rising China? And more generally, why do declining powers often aid the rise of potential competitors? And one of the arguments I want to make today, and the evidence I want to present, is that this is not an exception with regard to U.S. policy towards China. In fact, if we look at historical cases of rising great powers, this is a recurrent pattern that we see of existing great powers cooperating with states that eventually actually become an adversary, and in some cases with whom they go to war. So we know, just most of you know this already, but we know certainly that there's no mystery about China's rise. Here's sort of economic rise of China. The red line there with the black dots, the one that has the most upward trajectory, will look familiar to many of you as the trajectory of China's rise over the last couple of decades. And certainly militarily as well, China, these numbers are, well, any sort of data numbers from China are notoriously difficult to rely on, but I'll just sort of throw these out here as notionally kind of accurate numbers, right, of China's military rise as well. So there's no question about the sort of, either, I would say there's no question about where China's been in the past, both economically and military, and militarily, and the trajectory that it has been on over these last few decades. So, what I want to try and explain today is, in the context of that rise, what explains the pattern of cooperation between the United States and China? Why have we seen this persist, despite what many would expect to be a competitive relationship between the United States and China? And essentially, I want to argue here that, that existing great powers, relatively declining great powers, often prefer what we might call a grand strategy of procrastination. What we might call a grand strategy of kicking the can down the road, rather than dealing with the short-term costs of having to confront a rising country like China. And I'll lay this out in thinking about sort of 4 different dimensions of the argument, 4 different aspects of it that I think are worth keeping in mind. And then for each of these, I'll try and draw on some of the historical material that I present in the book to illustrate the theoretical point that I'm trying to make. All right, so first is manipulation of uncertainty. Those of you who have spent, which is probably most of you, have spent a lot of time reading international relations theory and encountered international relations theory, know that uncertainty is considered to be one of the great evils in international relations, right? Uncertainty leads to all sorts of bad things taking place in international politics. Most famously, Robert Jervis's security dilemma, right, is centrally informed by uncertainty about future intentions and the way that that can lead to competition. One of the things that I argue in the book, actually, though, is that uncertainty can be strategically valuable, right? And that uncertainty actually leaves open space for cooperation where it otherwise wouldn't be present if you juxtapose it to, say, a situation in which you have certainty about another country's intentions, future intentions, and you think they're malign, right? That's certainly going to foreclose opportunities for cooperation. Uncertainty actually leaves some room for potential cooperation between states, and in this case, between rising and declining states. And one of the important distinctions that I would draw here is I think there's been a tendency in the literature to think about uncertainty as sort of a dichotomous variable, right? Either you are 100% certain that they are malign, right? Or you have zero certainty at all, right? It's kind of, and from that zero certainty, you have to assume the worst, right? In fact, I think the way that the states generally approach this, rather than thinking about it dichotomously like this, is as more of a sort of probabilistic variable, more like risk than uncertainty, right? This is an old distinction from the economics literature that goes back to the 1930s, a distinction between uncertainty, which is when you truly don't know about something, right? And can't even make a probabilistic projection about what another actor is going to do, for example. Versus risk, which when all of us cross the street any given day, we make assessments of the risk of crossing the street, right? And the argument that I make is that if you think of this as risk rather than uncertainty, states are willing to cooperate with others about whom they have some doubt about their long-term intentions. And they make probabilistic estimates, and they pursue strategies that hedge their bets and protect themselves, but that doesn't foreclose the possibility of cooperation. And one of the reasons it doesn't foreclose the possibility of cooperation is because if you go down the road of arguing that states assume the worst about intentions, right? If they actually were going to follow the strategies that such an assumption suggested, it would be prohibitively expensive for them to do it, right? And I simply don't think there's much evidence that this is what states in practice actually do. Right. So, what does this lead to? It leads to an observation that rising powers at the same time have an incentive to maintain uncertainty about their intentions. Right? It behooves them to have uncertainty out there that can actually open this space for cooperation between rising powers and declining powers. Go back to Deng's quote, right? It behooved China to maintain some uncertainty about Chinese intentions. Even if they knew that they had malign intentions over the long term, if you can maintain some uncertainty about that, it opens the possibility of cooperation. Now, this does raise a puzzle, and one that I'll return to later, which is what explains change, right? If cooperation is possible, if uncertainty creates the space for cooperation, why does this end? Why do rising powers turn away from these types of strategies and, in fact, turn aggressive, what I would characterize as prematurely? I'll come back to that towards the end of my talk. So, an historical example here from the case of Imperial Germany, late 19th century Germany, a period in which they apparently liked mustaches. So on your left here, Otto von Bismarck, the German chancellor who takes over and leads Germany from 1871 until he leaves office in 1890. And then on the right here, they're not sort of in the same positions, right? But this is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who becomes Kaiser in 1888, and becomes Kaiser at a very young age, and as many of you know, becomes Kaiser without necessarily the requisite skills for leading one of Europe's most powerful states at the time. So what's interesting about Bismarck, there's lots that's been written about Bismarck. What's interesting about Bismarck from the perspective of this particular part of the argument is that Bismarck understood that others around him were going to be fearful of Germany, right? And what Bismarck tried to do in this period from 1871 to 1890 is he tried to reassure others. He tried to give them a sense that you actually don't have to worry about Germany's intentions, that we are a sated power, quote unquote, his words, right? And you can rest easy that we no longer have aggressive intentions. Now, did other European powers wholly believe this? No, right? They had their continuing doubts about Bismarck, but it gave them enough space, right? Enough uncertainty that cooperation remained possible, right? And in fact, one of the notable things is between 1871 and 1890, when Bismarck leaves office, there is no concerted balancing effort against Germany during this period. Not a single alliance formed against Germany during this period. The first alliance to form against Germany is the Franco-Russian alliance, which comes together in 1893, 1894, after Bismarck has left office, and after Kaiser Wilhelm II here and Bismarck's successor, Caprivi, pursue a much more aggressive foreign policy that turns away from many of the things that Bismarck had pursued as German chancellor as a way of reassuring other European powers. For example, Wilhelm II turns away from the reinsurance treaty, an agreement that Germany had reached with Russia. Didn't really commit either side to very much, but was a sort of signal of reassurance, right? And gave the Russians some confidence. Bismarck sort of leaves office in 1890, and in 1890, when the reinsurance treaty expires, there's no interest in the new German leadership in renewing that treaty. And relations across Europe deteriorate from that point forward. So, second dimension of the argument, to add to this sort of aspect of uncertainty, is this kind of time horizons dimension that I mentioned earlier. And the way that I sort of characterize it in the book is that states confront what I call now or later dilemmas, which is to say that if you are the leader of an existing power, right, and you have your concerns about a rising great power, you have a choice between addressing that concern now or addressing it later, right? And there are advantages and disadvantages to both of those. If you address it now, you can potentially address that threat earlier, before it's a really powerful threat and a difficult to deal with threat. The downside is you got to pay the cost in the short term of doing that, right? And for, on the other hand, you could say, well, we'll address it later, and the advantages are the kind of inverse of that, right? That you can sort of say, all right, we'll address this later, and we don't have to pay the cost now, but if we deal with it later, it may be a much more difficult sort of threat to deal with. Now, dealing with it later also gives you the option that maybe that threat doesn't materialize, so you never have to pay that cost at all. So that adds to kind of the attractiveness of that option as well. Now, what I argue is that leaders generally prefer to act later, right? Leaders of existing great powers generally prefer to act later, and they prefer to act later for a few reasons, right? One is, again, the short-term costs of having to act now, right? And the other is the short-term cost of having to act now, and the possibility that if they kick this can down the road, maybe the threat doesn't materialize in the way that they fear. Now, on the flip side, the leaders of rising great powers face their own now or later dilemmas, right? They face their own choice about whether to act assertively in the short term or to wait, to bide their time, as Dung was suggesting, and hold off on that type of aggressive action. And the argument that I make there is that for most rising great powers, it behooves them to wait, to sort of not act aggressively in the short term, take advantage of cooperation, and that in fact they're willing to forego short-term opportunities for gain because they see sort of brighter days ahead, right? So they would rather sort of say, okay, we're not going to raise alarm bells now about our future intentions, but we'll sort of wait until later when we can actually, we'll be more powerful and we can act on our interests. Okay. Last point I would make on these now or later dilemmas is that one of the reasons that declining powers are sort of concerned about pursuing overly competitive strategies too soon is a concern about what I call irreversibility. Not my word, but there's a whole literature out. It's actually a very interesting literature kind of from economics, law and economics, on the sort of notion of irreversibility. And the idea that leaders are generally, when they consider different strategic options, they're concerned about pursuing irreversible strategies, right? Strategies, exactly what the word implies, right? That if you do take a certain course of action, you're not going to be able to reverse it, right? And you're going to limit your options going forward for strategies to pursue. And I think this too sort of leads those in power to avoid these types of strategies. So here I'll sort of draw on some other kind of history in the book, which is the case of Interwar Germany. And here Gustav Stresemann, the Weimar leader, on the right there, and Clemenceau, David Lloyd George, and Woodrow Wilson at Versailles after World War I. And the point that I would make on interwar Germany is that the countries sort of thinking about a potentially resurgent Germany in the 1920s in particular, the period I focused most of my attention on in the book, faced precisely this kind of now or later dilemma, right? They had no illusions about Germany's potential power and where it was going to kind of lead Germany and the potential it was going to give it to try and reclaim its interests as early as the 1920s. But they faced this dilemma between, do they want to do something about it now or do they want to do something about it later, right? And for most of them, this choice was, again, kind of relatively easy, right? That the cost of doing even more to Germany in the short term in the 1920s, right, was seen as prohibitive and was seen as something that was going to do even more damage to economies that were struggling to recover. Right? So for them, the preference was to address this threat later, if and when that threat materialized. On the flip side, Stresemann, right? Stresemann in some ways resembled Bismarck in that Stresemann sort of understood that it would be in his interest to not signal anything particularly threatening about German intentions, to play nice, to play along, whether or not those intentions are sincere. And in fact, there's been a pretty good historical debate about what Stresemann's ultimate intentions were had he remained in power for longer. But here you see this combination of the rising power preferring to sort of not act aggressively in the short term, and declining powers preferring, again, not to deal with the potential threat in the short term, which I would argue creates this space for cooperation. All right, third sort of aspect to add to this argument is that all threats are relative. We sort of have this sense that we talk about relative power all the time in international politics. And here I'm talking not just about in terms of capabilities, but also in terms of time. So the book really sort of tries to bring temporal variables in a variety of ways. And this is another way in which I try to bring that in, which is that when states think about the threats they face, there are some that are more immediate than others, and some that require more attention sooner than others. And in general, certain and immediate threats take priority over uncertain and distant threats. In general, addressing long-term potential threats is a luxury of the secure and wealthy. And the example that I would point to here, or I'll come to a historical example, but the contemporary example is, actually think if you look at the attention that the United States has paid to the potential rise of China since the end of the Cold War, right? Some of you, well, Tom's old enough to remember. I don't know about the rest, but Bob's old enough to remember, right? In the 1990s, right? In the 1990s, we see this sudden interest in the potential rise of China, right? The pages of International Security are filled with articles by a variety of heavyweights in the study of international relations on the potential rise of China, right? I would argue that one of the reasons that we see that attention to the potential rise of China in the 1990s, even though everybody agreed it was probably 30 years off and wasn't likely to happen, you know, that there were questions about whether it was going to happen at all, was that the United States faced no other significant threats in the 1990s. Right? Or at least it didn't perceive any other significant threats that it saw in the 1990s, and had the luxury of thinking about this potential long-term threat and thinking about whether it wanted to do anything about it. Right? Now, fast forward to September 11th, 2001, and I would argue that immediately in the aftermath of 9/11, right, American attention to the rise of China and the threat from the rise of China actually declines. Right? And in fact, there are efforts between the US and China. There's some sort of nascent cooperation on dealing with what each side sees as threats from terrorism. Right? And so the long-term threat from China kind of recedes from sort of the American way of thinking about China. And I would argue that fast forward another 15 years to now, right, I think there's more attention to the rise of China, in part because of some of the things that China has done. But I think, you know, over the last few years, as the United States has tried, somewhat kind of haltingly, right, to move on from its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right, it has created some space to be thinking about this other threat that's out there, which is the threat potentially from China. To illustrate one other historical example, the rise of the United States and British reactions to the rise of the United States, which I look at in the book. So the United States and Britain have a not particularly great relationship over the course of the 19th century. Sort of ups and downs through the War of 1812, the Civil War, all the rest. And what I focus on in the book in particular are a series of crises that the United States and Great Britain have at the end of the 19th century. And so these are maps of the Isthmus of Panama. One of the disputes is over the prospective Panama Canal at that point and who was going to control that canal if it was built. Border between Alaska and Canada, which becomes a sort of site of dispute between the U.S. And the British. And then the case of British Guiana, Venezuela, and a dispute over kind of territorial control that the British were maintaining in South America. What's noteworthy about all of these crises, I would say two things. One, they ought not be immediately dismissed as of trivial interest to the British, right, which is one thing that some people will do when they look at this period. The British Admiralty made it clear that they actually were concerned about the building of this canal if the British didn't weren't able to control who was able to pass through that canal. So these are not trivial concerns. In the case of Venezuela, there is somewhat exaggerated but somewhat legitimate talk of a war scare and the possibility of actual conflict between the U.S. and the British. What's interesting in all three of these cases is the British cede, right? The British turn over and basically abandon all hope in all three of these cases and accede to American wishes in all three cases, right? Now, why do they do this? They do this for a couple of reasons. One is, while this is going on, they have the Boer War that they're dealing with, right? And so they have other kind of more immediate issues that they're having to contend with. And secondly, they see the rise of Germany on the horizon, and they're evaluating sort of how threatening is the rise of Germany going to be to their interests as opposed to the rise of the United States. And in sort of all those calculations, they say, you know what, we're gonna sort of cede our interest here to the United States and basically allow the United States to kind of take control of these things. Now, the other interesting aspect of this case is that the British, and those of you who know me, have been in my classes, and have encountered me will be perhaps somewhat surprised to hear this, right? And there's an argument in the book that will be construed as by some as a somewhat, I can't even say it, constructivist argument. Yeah, see? Yeah, let's see. I know, it's breaking news, right?
Don't tell anyone.
Yeah, don't tell anybody. No, I will say as an aside, one of the things I actually like about this book is I think it's going to defy easy classification in theoretical schools. But the argument I would make, the constructivist aspect of this argument, is that one of the things that gives the British confidence in turning over these interests to the United States is a whole series of kind of realizations they come to about things like, and insert your sort of scare quotes as appropriate here, right? Shared Anglo-Saxon identity, right? A shared language, right? So there's lots of kind of public proclamations about sort of the shared ethnic sort of identity of Americans and Brits, and how it would be unfathomable to think about going to war with our brethren in North America, right? And this becomes a very sort of popular kind of notion, right, that I think contributes to certain British ideas about long-term American intentions and gives them some confidence that they don't have to be as worried about turning over these interests to the United States over the long term. And that, in fact, leads to the fourth kind of theoretical component here, which is that, as some of you who are sort of steeped in the IR theory debates know, there's something of a debate over kind of the sources of threat, the importance of capabilities as opposed to the importance of intentions. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that when sort of existing powers are thinking about rising great powers, they are not just thinking about their capabilities and not just making projections off of their capabilities and assuming the worst about intentions, but they're actually looking for information about those intentions and forming these probabilistic beliefs about what those intentions are, not just this kind of dichotomous, you know, are they benign, are they malign, but rather trying to take all the information in that's available, recognizing that it's not perfectly credible, but that if you put enough of this information together, you can come to some sort of probabilistic estimate of those intentions. So an example here that I look at, I'll say for, as Tom mentioned, the Mearsheimer, the origins of this project in some ways go back even further than Mearsheimer's book, which is they go back to a graduate seminar that I had in at Chicago at some point in the 1990s, and we got into a debate about the origins of the Cold War, and a rather heated argument between John and myself about whether or not the Cold War would have happened if Stalin had died in 1945 and been replaced by a liberal Democrat, right? Not a British liberal Democrat, but like a liberal Democrat in the broader sense. And Mearsheimer, being the good structuralist who he is, right, said no, right? There's a bipolar international system. It didn't matter, right? These domestic variables don't matter at all. I was a little bit more dubious of that claim, right? And part of my dubiousness about that claim is that I think intentions matter, right? And the way that kind of states interpret others' intentions matter. So I look in the book at the origins of the Cold War and some of the elements of that origins of the Cold War, and make the argument that the origins of the Cold War do not lie simply in American concerns about Soviet capabilities. Certainly an important aspect of it, right? And I'm not dismissing that at all. I'm not dismissing the importance of bipolarity. But that the seminal moments that made the Cold War concrete were, in fact, American interpretations of what Soviet intentions were. So just to kind of highlight two examples that I talk about in the book here. This picture is of a Soviet tank in northern Iran at the end of World War II. The Soviets were obligated to leave northern Iran within 6 months of the end of World War II, and they stalled on that, leading to American concerns that the Soviets were up to no good. There was no legitimate reason in the eye of American decision makers for the Soviets to want to control northern Iran, right? So the Soviet reluctance to leave there raised some concerns. Similarly, you see sort of newspaper excerpt here. Soviet claims on the Dardanelles in Turkey raised similar concerns about what Soviet intentions might be, not just their capabilities, but their intentions going forward. All right. So one final kind of question to answer here, which is why rising great powers grow impatient, right? I've argued that it behooves them to be patient because they can sort of benefit from cooperation with existing great powers. I'll say there are kind of three different sort of variables that I identify that lead to this impatience. One is domestic political pressure, right? Even if there are times when it may behoove a political leader to remain patient, right? There may be domestic political pressure in a rising great power for leaders to act more aggressively, more assertively, and show that they are this new great power in the international system. Second, baiting by smaller states, which is to say sometimes rising great powers are baited into more aggressive behavior precisely in order to get the attention of other allies, others who might sort of come to their aid. And here, I think the contemporary case is instructive, right? If you look at what's been happening in the South China Sea, right, I think there's actually plenty of blame to go around in what's going on in the South China Sea. There's certainly been a Chinese aggressive behavior, and I don't mean to diminish that at all. But I think there's also been a fair amount of aggressive behavior by the Philippines, by Vietnam, by others in the region that has, in a sense, poked at China, right? And put China in a position where they either have to say, we're going to accede to these smaller powers and what they want, or we're going to push back. But in the process of pushing back, it sends some signals about what our intentions might be, right? So they essentially get sort of trapped into this type of behavior of acting in more provocative ways than they otherwise might want to do. And then finally, there is an argument here that sometimes they grow impatient because they simply need more resources and they need to act impatiently in order to sustain their continuing growth, right? So if you think here, for example, the interwar period, Hitler gets to a point in the rise of Germany where he says, you know what, I can no longer sort of do this, right? I can no longer sustain the type of growth that I want in Germany, the military expenditures that I want in Germany, without more resources and without expanding Germany further. So even if it would have, in some sense, behooved Germany to be more patient, at some point it becomes irreconcilable with Hitler's overall goals. And here, just go through this because I'm running out of time here and I want to wrap up. So just to summarize what I'm saying here about the politics of uncertainty. Uncertainty about the future can encourage cooperation as much as competition. Rising powers have incentives to manipulate beliefs about their intentions, while declining powers have incentives to put off the expense of balancing against a rising great power. So where does cooperation come from? Cooperation comes from rising great powers that are acting patiently and benefiting from cooperation, and declining great powers that don't want to pay the short-term cost of balancing against that state, right? And it's the intersection of those kind of two temporal preferences that facilitate cooperation there. More generally, I would say temporal dynamics in international politics, if this book accomplishes anything in the larger kind of IR theory world, right, that's one of the things I'd like it to accomplish, which is to encourage people to think more actively about this, I think, understudied dimension of international politics. And beyond those sort of temporal dynamics, to think more generally about kind of what I would call the uncertain role of uncertainty. Right? Again, I think that IR theory has often made assumptions about the consequences of uncertainty that aren't necessarily justified. Right? Uncertainty certainly can lead to negative things, and it can lead to competition, it can lead to conflict. But I think it also, as I would argue, leads to space for potential cooperation. And then lessons for the rise of China. So, as I've suggested, I think the track record of U.S. aiding the rise of China is not surprising in the logic of my argument, and it's in fact one that has ample precedent in other historical cases. Washington has generally preferred later for now to addressing the potential Chinese threat. And the extent to which the U.S. has been attentive to this Chinese threat has depended in large degree on the nature of other threats, whether they have been kind of more temporally sort of distant or close at hand. In terms of sort of provocative Chinese behavior, as we've seen over the last couple of years, I think you could point to these sort of three different factors, right? The domestic political factor, the baiting by other powers, and perhaps less so, but perhaps somewhat, the need for additional resources that have led to kind of China, I would argue, acting aggressively sort of prematurely, right? I mean, this is something now I've talked to about some of my friends who are much more kind of China scholars than I am, right? There is something of a puzzle about why China decided to become more aggressive in the South China Sea when it did, right? As opposed to kind of waiting longer. And so something that patience would have been and might continue to be a virtue for China, but it is hardly a certain thing that it will occur. With that, I will wrap up there, and thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. I just made a mistake, which I always tell my grad students not to do, which is never try to present an entire project in 40 minutes. But I try to do it nonetheless because you all came to your help. So that's what I tried to do. Thank you so much. Professor Crane.
Well, first of all, congratulations.
Thank you.
Really interesting book. I enjoyed the talk, and I'll think about international politics and this question differently from this point forward. The question I had was, you said your argument's part constructivist, part realist. So I wonder about the third major paradigm, because when I was thinking about U.S.-China and this puzzle of why does the United States cooperate with China, first explanation I thought of is that U.S. policymakers have a different mental model in mind, a kind of liberal internationalism or a liberal hegemony. So it's not inconsistent with your argument, but it seems to be a slightly different take, that the U.S. thinks that our strategy with China today shapes who China will be in the future, and that if we cooperate, they'll play our game, they'll become democratic, they'll be enmeshed in institutions, and so they'll be more cooperative in the future because we're cooperating with them today. So is that
yeah.
is that wrong?
No, so well, it is wrong, but it's the right question. And so in the book there are kind of two alternative arguments that I mostly deal with. One is the kind of Mearsheimer alternative argument about assumptions of the worst, I think I deal with that both theoretically and empirically, and suggest that it's not correct. The other alternative would be a kind of liberal alternative, right? That would say precisely this cooperation is about changing the intentions of rising great powers, right? You cooperate with them, you trade with them, you do all these things because you have some hope that over time this will shape their intentions in a positive direction. I think there is some truth in this, right? And I think there is some truth in that this is what cooperation is partly motivated about. I think some of the evidence that undermines that as a potential kind of source of this cooperation, especially in some of the historical cases, is that the cooperation we observe is actually pragmatic, short-term oriented cooperation, right? It's about kind of very much sort of just, I'm going to make you wealthy in the short term and I'm going to help you get wealthy in the short term, right? And I think one would expect that if you were trying to shape intentions over the long term, there might be different forms of cooperation that you would expect to see, more sort of institutionalized types of cooperation than you see in some of these other cases. I would say in the case of China, I think you could argue there's been more of that than we've seen in other cases, but that's kind of mostly my response to that. I would just, while you're mentioning paradigms though, right? There's one other, which is that I gave a version of this a few years ago maybe 2 years ago at Ohio State. And Alex Wendt was in the audience, and so I've known him for a while, right, and he didn't try and push me to be a constructivist, at least not in the kind of conventional type, but he raised his hand and he went on this 5-minute diatribe about Marxism, right, and his argument was that what could explain this cooperation was that a Marxist would say, this is about something much larger than any bilateral relationship between the United States and China, right? This is about a kind of economic system that sort of transcends the globe, right, and sort of propels this type of cooperation forward, regardless of what any kind of, pissant government might want to do, right? That this is about kind of these economic forces that you simply can't push back against. I struggled for a long time with ways to incorporate that into the book, and I think it finally got a footnote, but I couldn't really. I'm not smart enough on that stuff. John.
Yeah, again, congratulations.
Thank you.
One of the things I was thinking about, especially as you gave your first two examples, was so the puzzle was that the rising powers in particular were trying to make themselves appear as if they were less threatening, and that also changed the calculation of the declining power. But the question I kept thinking about was, are they making the right calculation? So there's one version, I think, where you could say that kind of in an expected value rational way, the declining power makes the correct decision to cooperate because of uncertainty about intention or whatever, discounting for the future, etc. And then there's another version of the argument where it would say that because of whatever is going on in the states, either something about human psychology, something about electoral systems, or the timelines in which leaders are thinking, that they are overly discounting the future, thinking more short term, and that therefore they're making what are essentially expected value irrational decisions for their government interests that make it so that the rising power is in a better position. Based off of the cases, or even just theoretically, which side of that is kind of comes out more, and how does kind of that fit within the broader argument?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I would say I avoid in the book characterizing any of this behavior as rational or non-rational, right? I don't think there's necessary kind of temporal preferences, right? And the amount to which you discount the future, there's nothing inherently rational or non-rational about that, right? You could have any kind of discount function, and that could be characterized as either rational or non-rational. I take your question to be, and I think it's a smart question, right, is do they make mistakes on this, right? And would they be kind of better off if they acted in one way or another, right? In some ways, this is my own tragedy of great power politics, right? Which is that I think if you look at, well, the U.S. and the British case kind of ended well, right? But if you look at the other cases, you know, where we did see some kind of limited cooperation or not so limited cooperation, they haven't necessarily ended well, right? And so I think, you know, part of the kind of the pessimistic takeaway from the book, right, is that, you know, while it's great that you get this cooperation in the short term and it may look good in the short term, that over the long term they come to regret having done this, right? I'd be the first to say, though, all right, so take that one step further, and what do you actually want to do with that, right? Does that mean that you want to say, okay, we're gonna immediately move to an even more competitive strategy than we've had in the past? I'm not sure that that'd be wise either, right? And I think there are kind of trade-offs that have to be made all along the way there. What I would say is I think this is cooperation that these states have come to regret over time. Dasha.
So also thank you and congratulations for all of this. I wonder about the extension to regional politics,
Yeah.
like rising powers like Iran. Does the argument extend to that sort of context as well?
I think it would. Yeah, I mean, I don't see any reason for it inherently not to, right? And I think certainly this kind of, you know, towards the end of the book when I have the necessary section in which I talk about how to extend the theoretical argument in all sorts of directions, right? I think I would like to think that this logic of kind of now or later dilemmas, right, and this logic of kind of the temporal trade-offs that leaders have to make, I think it applies. I don't see any reason why it needs to just apply in kind of this sort of global great power setting. I also, you know, suggest in the book that there are a variety of other kind of issue areas in which you can think about it applying, everything from, you know, environmental policy, right, to weapons training. You know, Matt, you get a footnote, right? Matt gets a footnote on nuclear technology transfer, right? And you think about the kind of short-term versus long-term trade-offs of that type of thing. So, thanks. From the former student section back there, Alex. Yeah.
Thanks, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
I'd be interested in whether you think the domestic politics of great powers plays a role, not just in the sense of conveying intentions, but in evaluating the short-term versus long-term sort of risk assessment that you discussed. And specifically, I was thinking that you know, a president, for example, who expects to serve for maybe 8-year term is going to be making different assessments than, say, an autocrat who assumes they'll be in power for decades.
Yeah, so it's interesting. As you might expect, right, in doing this research, I looked for various arguments made, you know, if you want to think about it in kind of traditional IR theory terms, at kind of different levels of analysis about sources of time horizons, right? So there are kind of individual level arguments out there about psychology and kind of the way that individual leaders might think about long-term versus short-term, domestic level and even kind of systemic level ones that you can infer. The domestic level arguments are interesting, right? Because on the one hand, there are arguments out there that suggest that that democracies and democratic leaders have short time horizons because they can't think about anything beyond the next election, right? So that's one set of arguments out there. There's another argument out there that Tocqueville makes, right? Tocqueville actually suggests that in the U.S. context, that one of the great virtues of the U.S. political system is that it projects into the future and thinks about the kind of future consequences, right? So that's sort of, I saw that wry smile. That's a potential kind of twist on that argument. And then the authoritarian argument, right? You would think exactly what you said, right? That kind of authoritarian states, right, would be inclined to think more about the long term because they don't have to worry about that next election. But then I think if you look at the kind of the one of the recent waves of literature on authoritarianism, right? You know, you think about kind of Jessica Weeks's work, you think about other, that have suggested, you know what, authoritarian regimes have audiences that they need to answer to just as much as a democratic leader needs to answer to. And oh, by the way, if you're an authoritarian leader and you don't listen to your audiences, something far worse than getting voted out of office might happen to you, right? So, and then, you know, just to add one other argument, right? Steve Rosen at Harvard, his somewhat funky little book on kind of tyrants, right, and kind of brain science and all. It's interesting book, right? But has a really interesting discussion there on kind of tyrants and time horizons, right? And basically argues that when you're dealing with tyrants who may be in power for a long time, those folks also tend to be very paranoid, right? And paranoia means that you kind of focus very much on the short term because you're worried that everybody's out to get you, right? So I think your basic instinct was the basic instinct I had. Oh, this is easy, right? Democracies have to have short time horizons. Authoritarian leaders can have longer time horizons. I think one of the things I've learned in the process of the book, studying kind of a lot of the more recent literature on that, is it's not as clear cut as that, right? And in fact, kind of domestic level variables can be somewhat kind of indeterminate on this. Alex.
So one of the things that I recall thinking reading the manuscript was that you know, it's interesting.
What did I not address?
No. You do talk about it, but you know, I'm eager to see how it's changed since then, if at all. But the notion that your future intentions are private information, even to yourself.
Yeah.
And the extent to which intentions or goals or aspirations of rising powers may change once they start to see that, you know, they're being given a little bit of running room or some scope for cooperation. And so if you could just elaborate in the empirical work, you know, to what extent did you find that they harbored, you know, grand ambitions all along, or those kind of slowly developed over time?
I think it's a combination of both, right? I think it's a combination of, you know, my own here I guess my kind of my realism comes through in some regard, right? Which is that I think states are in a competitive international system, and so they always are looking for opportunities for relative gain, even if that doesn't mean maximizing relative gain at all times. I also think that yes, as kind of states develop, they see room for kind of grow their ambitions a little bit. They tend to do that, and I don't want to, you know, the last thing I want to do is you know, give my realism card away at the door or something, right? I mean, I think you know, there is a centrally important part of this, right? Is as states become more powerful, they also become more ambitious, right? And that's part of the story here as well. And certainly part of the reason why these states over time come to see these others as more threatening is that they're becoming more capable. I just think it's too crude to treat it as that being the only part, the story. From the current student section.
And thank you very much for your presentation. I was thinking in the beginning when you were talking about uncertainty, its relationship to misperception.
Yeah.
And how, while techniques that states may use to increase uncertainty within the system to enable some sort of cooperation, it may also introduce volatility by causing other states to misperceive their intentions, and as they iterate, maybe increase the propensity for misperception over time. Do you see states accounting for that, or do you see effects of that in your research?
My own sense is that states are not usually all that cognizant of their own misperceptions, right? That they tend to think that they're perceiving everything correctly, right? So I don't see a lot of evidence of states kind of thinking very consciously about, are we getting this right or are we getting this wrong? I'd say the one exception to that, right, which doesn't necessarily have to do as much with misperception as just a kind of debate, right, is that one of the parts of this book that I most enjoyed doing the research on were debates in 1945, 1946 within the U.S. government, various parts of the U.S. government, over the nature of the Soviet threat, right? And there were legitimate, significant debates over that, right? In which there was a kind of group of analysts, right, who said this is not necessarily the way this has to go, right? That there's another route in which this could go down that would be a much more kind of cooperative and sort of more optimistic vision. Now, they didn't carry the day, and they didn't carry the day for good reason, right? But I do think there was discussion, debate there. Again, not necessarily informed by misperception, right? But at least there was some cognizance there of there are kind of different sides to this that they need to listen to. Bob.
Terrific talk.
Thank you.
Nice job, and well worth doing the whole kahuna right here. A big point and two much smaller ones. The bigger point is the impact of external events in seizing opportunities. China, based on the statements of its leaders, was pursuing, quote, peaceful rise.
Yes.
And the financial crisis, '08, and so forth, seems to have been a trigger point in which they then shift from peaceful rise to the China dream, which is a sugar-coated way of pushing very hard. And that seems to have pushed them to move away from the Deng Xiaoping approach into where they are now. His two smaller points are, on the graph I showed about China GDP, that's based on purchasing power parity. The IMF says that for purposes of international comparison, they prefer GDP at market exchange rates. And on that basis, China still has quite a ways to go in catching up with the U.S. The other smaller point is to reinforce the significance of intentions and, if you like, the small c concept.
Yeah.
And that is, we don't worry about British and French nuclear forces. We had mixed views about them at the beginning, but we don't worry about them at all compared to Iran and North Korea because of the societies that those two are compared to the others.
Yeah. No, so on the last point, I agree entirely, and it is this. This is an argument that Alex Went has made, right? Everything kind of comes together at some point, I guess. But I don't necessarily think of Bob Lieber and Alex Went in the same theoretical school.
Nor do
I. I agree, and point taken, right? I think the interesting question there, right, goes to, I mean, that's in some sense an obvious example, right, that we can think of that I think illustrates the point brilliantly, right? In tougher cases, what is it exactly that leaders are looking at to discern intentions, right? And I will say, as somebody who's now written a book that tries to establish the importance of intentions, that question remains to me one of these really hard questions that we don't have a great answer to still, right? About the relative weight that states and leaders put on different things, right? The point taken on Chinese economic issues, and I agree with you, right? I think China has a long way to go on this. On the kind of the importance of kind of trigger events or kind of these kind of important events that might shift things in one direction or another, I don't have a great answer to that, right? In part because I think those things are hard to sort of anticipate and hard to know about, right? I do think that, to the extent that the financial crisis prompted a change in the Chinese grand strategy, right, what would be interesting for me would be to then look at and see, okay, how did that contribute to sort of Chinese impatience, right? Why was it that event that propelled them to act more aggressively, right? Did they see an opportunity? Did they see weakness in the U.S. and others that they could act upon, right? Interesting potential explanation, right? Was it something about kind of domestic politics? Was it about the prospect of China having its own economic difficulties that led them to look for sort of another opportunity out there to potentially act upon, right? And so I think it's a great question, right, about these kind of events. I think, I'll say more generally, I think we don't pay enough attention to these types of events, right? I mean, I'm reluctant to say it's sort of a kind of, the old Cleopatra's nose, the butterfly hits the nose and everything kind of goes haywire from there, right? But I do think there's something about these kind of particular events that we can't ignore the fact that they have this type of impact. They're just hard to predict. Right?
So, I have a little encouraging.
Thank you. Thank you.
So cooperation and competition aren't really binary things, right? They're a correlation of events. So trying to think about this in terms of China, I'm having trouble figuring out where we are, right? How much do we have to cut about IT and how should we spend on missiles before we know we're cooperating?
Yeah, so It's a great question, right? And it's something in the book that I try and kind of delineate, not at great length, because I didn't want to turn the whole book into it, right? But delineate somewhat kind of, what is the spectrum of kind of cooperative as opposed to more competitive strategies that the states might pursue towards each other? And I agree with you. I think in the context of kind of current American relations with China, there are so many different dimensions to it, right, in so many different ways, and people coming at this question, looking at it from you know, where you stand depends on where you sit, right, are going to see different things in this and see different aspects of this relationship, right? I mean, I've talked to people in the Pentagon, for example, right, or people who have otherwise been involved with the military, right, who think I'm crazy, who are like, there's no cooperation with China, right? There hasn't been any cooperation. We're getting ready to fight a war with China, right? And I think there's certainly some truth in that, right? But then, you know, come into the district and go over to, well, maybe not now, but, you know, talk to somebody at the State Department, if there's anybody there, right? And, you know, have a conversation with them, right? And they would characterize this relationship in a different way. And I would say, this is just an observation, some of you may be looking for a dissertation topic at some point, right? This is a consistent point that I've observed in looking at all of these historical cases, right? And it's not a surprising observation, but to me it's a kind of interesting, consistent one, right? Which is that bureaucracies matter, right? And in don't laugh, Nick. And in particular, the kind of the nature of particular bureaucracies matter, right? So consistent observation throughout all my cases, right? The defense, Pentagon, whatever the kind of military aspect of a certain country, whichever one I was looking at, vis-a-vis the kind of diplomatic, state, economic, right? The former are consistently, without variation, more hawkish than the latter, right? Which again, probably shouldn't surprise you, right? Or doesn't surprise you, right? But it's interesting how that then kind of impacts when all that stuff comes together and policy actually has to be made, right? And I think it's interesting in all of these cases, right? Because when I talk to some people about these cases who have only read the military side of things, right? They miss a whole other side of it and vice versa. Anjali.
I'm so excited to read this book.
Thank you.
I wanted to pick up on Matt's question about the liberal explanations of this, because in your answer you noted that the liberal explanation better fits the Chinese case than it fits the historical cases. And I wonder to what extent that isn't because we have liberal institutions that we didn't have in previous cases. And so because of that, you know, just thinking about your explanations, is there actually temporal variation in these, right? So like, are some options off the table today because of the way in which US policy invests China in particular institutions, right? Are some sort of strategies of combating rising powers or dealing with declining powers no longer possible, right? And would that mean that liberals were more right than possibly we thought?
No, I think it's a really smart question, right? And I think yes, right. I mean, the institutions that we have now, right, did not exist in the late 19th century, right? That's a simple observation of fact, and there wasn't any effort to create the institutions that we have now in the late 19th century. So I certainly think that there is more truth to kind of these liberal arguments now than there was then. I'm not sure there's a kind of teleology to this, right? I'm not sure that we can be confident that this is going to kind of continue and that the institutions are going to be successful in kind of managing this relationship, right? And, you know, I think Ian Johnston's work on kind of the socialization of China and kind of bringing it into these institutions is important kind of informative work on this, right? Again, though, I'm curious to see where this goes, right, as China now is acting more assertively and, you know, international courts are saying, China, don't do that, and China's saying, well, we appreciate your opinion, right, you know, and continues to do what it wants to do. Yes, sir.
From the way I interpreted it, you presented it as a unilateral operation. You haven't considered that there are other institutions and nations that also shape the situation. As an example, both the U.S. denayed China, other nations will. Matter of fact, the Taiwanese corporations, I think, have been the most aiding in the growth of China by investing in building huge factories in China?
Yeah, and it's a fair question, and certainly as I've talked about the kind of China case, and frankly, as I mostly talk about it in the book, I talk about it in terms of kind of the Sino-American relationship. I will say I try to be more attentive at other points in the book, in the theoretical discussion and some of the other cases, to the fact that you're exactly right, that these are not simply bilateral relationships, but that there are multiple different states acting who have different interests, and those interests intersect and push against each other in various ways. So I think you're right, and it's an important corrective, to the way that I've been talking about it today. But I am aware of it, and I think you're right that to simplify this down to a simple kind of two-state bilateral relationship is too simplistic. Yes.
To piggyback off this idea that there are other powers, and you said you didn't leave your realist card at the door, so I have to ask, what's the role of polarity in your argument? Does it matter if, for the United States and Britain, that they were coming out of a multipolar world, and now we're in unipolar, bipolar?
Yeah.
Does that matter?
Yeah. So I tried, this is probably revealing too much information, but I could go to an IR Fury crowd. Don't worry, nothing scandalous is coming. I tried really hard at my first cut through this book to make this a structural realist book. I will be honest about it. I tried really hard to kind of make an argument that one could deduce from the structure of the international system what the time horizons of a state were likely to be, and with the kind of the argument being that in multipolar international systems, where we know all the characteristics of multipolarity that make them dangerous and all the rest, that states couldn't afford to think about the long-term future in a multipolar international system. In a bipolar system, you know who the other threat is, and you can afford to kind of think about them more long-term and address them more long-term. I will say that thread of the argument is still in the book, and I still make that argument. I think it doesn't, as is the problem with lots of structural arguments, it didn't capture enough of the variation for me to be happy with it, So, for example, you look at the case I do on kind of late 19th century Germany, That's a multipolar international system. There is variation within that multipolar international system, as we've talked about in SEST 500 this semester, if you have that type of variation, it's hard to kind of pin it down to a structural argument. So it's there. It wasn't satisfying enough to me, and I was willing to sacrifice some parsimony for explanatory power. Nick.
So this is like a minor point, but I think it's important to think about.
Yes.
This is very related to Anjali and Viola and Matt's points, So one account, there's a liberal argument which is just like institutions constrained. There's a liberal argument we have new institutions that play a new role. There's also a liberal argument for lack of a better term, which is like there are returns to scale up cooperation, And so like you can start off in the short term and you're cooperating, and then it's not just that you get socialized, it's that actually the pot just gets a whole lot bigger, And so I'm not sure how that fits in with this framework, and in that vein, how does this relate to like Copeland's?
Yeah, I take the point that kind of cooperation begets cooperation, And the pot grows bigger. I guess this is where the kind of play my realist card, Which is that even as the pot gets bigger, that states are going to want their slice of it, And are going to be competitive over what part of that pie they're getting, and it's not going to be satisfying to them that they are simply getting absolutely more, They're going to be concerned about kind of the relative slice of that larger pie that they're getting.
Yeah, so I'm with you there, But then there's also the issue of like the interdependence that gets created as a function of that,
Right, whether you can walk away from that interdependence. Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't. I'm actually not a fan of whenever that argument comes up, just saying World War I and walking away, I think that's too simplistic, I will also say though that I'm not completely confident that the high degree of economic interdependence between the United States and China now, is going to prevent us from going to war with each other. Anyone hasn't asked a question yet, or I'll go back to yes.
So I wonder, if you, I'm thinking about the puzzle of why, I guess you could think about it from both sides, why established powers go too late, or what triggers them to sort of finally make the plunge into aggressive competition, but more importantly, why rising powers go too early. And I wondered to what extent status, comes into it in some way that can be has explanatory power beyond material interest. So I think about Japan, Imperial Japan. There was some value to getting over on Russia that exceeded just the coal and minerals that you could. I mean, research is a huge part of it. But and I think Renshin has a paper on status deficits and war. So how did that come in? How did you find that?
Renshin has a paper, and our former student Steve Ward has a whole book coming out on status, and Steve and I have just for all of you out there, right? Steve is one of my favorite, beloved graduate students, and we do not agree on a thing, and it's great. Other than that, this stuff matters. We agree on that. So yeah, I think on the status issue, I would say one, I try and capture part of that in the domestic politics aspect of it, right? But I would also say that the type of status that Renshin's talking about, the type of status that that Steve is talking about, the type of status that Gilpin talks about, right, is not just kind of domestically motivated status concerns, but kind of international status concerns. I would bluntly say I'm not as persuaded that this is as much of a concern for states as some of the other kind of material types of factors that I look to. I certainly think, I have the three factors I identify in the book. One could certainly find evidence, I think, in certain cases of state concern for status, right, or prestige, right, if you wanted to add that there. I think, part of the challenge there, though, is if what they're concerned about is status or prestige, would they still be better off waiting rather than acting sort of sooner to claim that?
So before we were talking about competition and cooperation as on
I still didn't satisfy you, huh? Yeah.
Well, this is building off of both your answer and Anjali's point.
Yes.
But I wonder if the two have to be at odds, or if the cooperation piece may be, offering China a seat at our table with extra scoop of ice cream. And
so I know where you're going with this, and I'm going to tell you this. Here's the story that drove me nuts at one point. Right? Nick, you might like this one. So really, listen. Which is, so I did work at with Mearsheimer in Chicago. My chair was actually Steve Walt, right? And so Steve and I have talked a lot about these things, and he's read, this all. And at one point, Steve, right, who proudly proclaims himself a realist despite his work, Steve says to me, but cooperation is a form of balancing, right? And I just, it was by emails. I think I virtually got up and walked away. Right? I take his point, right? I take the point that you could see cooperation as a way of sort of trying to enmesh and kind of constrain another state, right? But to me, this goes to larger debates, right? That Nexon's talked about, that other people have talked about, right? Which is we have these concepts that are central to our study of international relations, right? Things like cooperation, competition, balancing, that when we use them, we have no idea what we're talking about, right? Yet we persist, right? We persist as a field, right? And anybody who's written a book, anybody who's trying to write a book, right, knows that you can't do it perfectly, right? And you're your own toughest critic, right? And I could list for you now the top 20 things that are dreadfully wrong with the book, right? And one of them on the list, right, would be that this kind of spectrum of cooperation competition is just a really hard thing to align on a linear spectrum like that, right? And that there are just all sorts of levels of kind of complexity there that you have to make simplifications to kind of to move on with your life, right, and finish the book, right? But that in an ideal world, you kind of complicate these things. Thank you all so much for coming.